Thank you, Sam. Good afternoon, everyone. There are a lot of things that result in changed regulations, and some of them involve amendments to law. Some of them involve updates in bank practices, and some of them involve provisions that are just plain outdated. Regulation CC fits any one or all of those definitions. And if there ever was a regulation that needed to be updated, Regulation CC is it. There are a number of parts of Regulation CC that are out of date because the environment has changed. We know, for instance, that there are no more non-local checks, and yet major portions of the regulation continue to refer to non-local checks. Many of the provisions in the model forms refer to non-local check provisions. So there are a number of reasons that Regulation CC needs to be updated. On page 2 in your handouts, there's a quick list of things that we're going to talk about today that the Fed has so far anticipated or has included in its attempts to provide proposals for updates to the regulation. Some of the things that happened, for instance, was the Dodd-Frank Act. Dodd-Frank Act was passed way back in 2010, 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago. And it updated parts of the Expedited Funds Availability Act effective on July 21st of 2011, and yet there was no change in the regulation. Bankers, on the other hand, were required to update their processes, their disclosures, and their practices with respect to the so-called next day amount of, it used to be $100. The Check 21 Act was, of course, passed back in the early parts of the 21st century, and as a result, much of the paperwork that financial institutions exchange in the way of checks has now been converted to electronics. And that really has been the push for the phasing out of the term non-local. There are very few banks that now insist upon paper items for chargebacks, for instance, for return items. In the middle of the page, on middle of page 1 of your handout, there's a quick statement. When the Fed posted the most current proposal, which it refers to as its 2013 proposal because they released it in December of last year. I refer to it as their February proposal because it was not published until February of this year. There were more than 99.9% of all checks that are presented that were transferred to the payee bank, that is forward collection. Over 99% of them were handled electronically. 99.0% of Fed return checks and 97% of Fed receipt return checks have been processed in electronic form as of the end of 2013. There's no question that the old definitions in the regulation no longer fit today's processing realities, and they need attention. And finally, one point here is the Fed wants to use the regulations in a sort of carrot and stick approach to wring out the last of those banks banks and other financial institutions that insist upon or request paper transactions for their processing. It's also notable that the first proposal that the Fed put out was back in 2011, as I mentioned. It's been 3 years since that proposal hit the Federal Register, and nothing was heard from the Fed until, well, the end of 2013 when it put out the most recent proposal, which actually makes changes to the proposal made in 2011 with respect to two sections of the regulation. And those two sections are subparts C and D, which have to do with check collection and with substitute checks. So the purpose of our discussion today, then, is to familiarize you with the Federal Reserve's proposals to the amendment and the issues raised by those proposals, and give you at least a guess as to what the final rule is going to look like. So let's look at it in overview to start with. Over on page 3, there's no question that a major thrust of the proposal is the promotion of electronic clearing and the electronic returns. The Fed has said as much, and it's spent most of this discussion in both of its proposals in talking about getting all or most, virtually all, of the paper checks that are handled in the system to be handled electronically. And there's two reasons for that, quite frankly. One is to speed up the collection of checks and the return of checks, and the other is to be able to phase out the infrastructure that the Fed has in place in order to handle paper items. Don't forget that as long as there are paper items, the Federal Reserve System has to maintain systems that are designed to handle those items, just as other financial institutions that clear checks, that run, or organizations that run check clearing houses have to maintain those pieces of equipment and so forth that are designed to handle paper items. When the paper items stop happening, then those investments can be allowed to become phased out, and all of the handlers of the items can focus strictly on electronic clearing and return. So there are savings to be had by the industry as a whole once there are no longer any participants that require paper items. Eventually, I believe virtually all financial institutions will drop their insistence upon paper items, and when that happens, then the Fed and others will make it financially unfeasible for banks to continue to require paper clearing except in extraordinary circumstances. That's just my forecast. Another part of the proposal, at least the 2014 proposal, is to address electronically created items. Electronically created items are described on the bottom of page 3 of your handout. It really was designed, or electronically created items were initially designed to make an end run around the so-called warranty provisions of Regulation CC with respect to remotely created checks, RCCs, and the Fed adjustment procedures that address unauthorized remotely created checks. So the industry, that is certain parts of not the financial services industry, but certain merchants or others decided that they would come up with this electronically created item, which would, in essence, be neither fish nor fowl, in that it has no roots in a paper item, even though it looks like an electronic representation of a paper item. It looks like an image of a paper item, but it was created electronically. It never existed on paper, and therefore it falls into some legal cracks that the Fed is trying to patch together with these rules or these proposals. Another portion of the rule, of the proposed rule, that is, addresses remote deposit capture items, which also fall into a rather unique crack with respect to Regulation CC, inasmuch as they are not